The theme of this week's class is embodiment, which is, of course, the theme of the module as a whole. The first thing to recognize, I think, in the context of this module is that there is no single theory of embodied cognition. As we'll see, there are two terms, embodiment and cognition, and they are both wide-ranging and often very contested. Without a doubt, we are embodied beings. I think that is probably the least controversial thing that one could claim, although I don't know. But for this module, anyway, we'll assume that we are embodied beings. And the body is always a site of contestation. In every social order, the body is policed, the body is nurtured, there are values associated with the body. There are very strong views on what's appropriate and not appropriate for a body to do. Bodies are shaped, fashioned, normed. And in all this, the relationship between the body and the person is being developed. Some of the most controversial questions in any society revolve around rights. Who can tell what they can and cannot do? The very notion of human rights place the individual body and the person together without telling us how to solve this problem. And in 2021, it's a long time after the French Revolution, but issues such as abortion and euthanasia are still very much with us. Depending on how we view the body and its role, we will draw the line between the sane and the insane differently. I don't need to point out to you the contested role of the body in all matters pertaining to love, sex, human relationships, and more recently in gender expression. The manner in which we regard the body will also determine what we consider to be a mental health issue. We may come up with a definition for well-functioning of a body. We've never done that for mind. But nevertheless, we seem to be compelled to conduct a discourse in which we define an area called mental health by analogy with our view to the proper functioning of the body. The question of who gets to do what with bodies doesn't only affect that border, of course. It affects psychiatric institutions and prisons typically play a huge role in any society, alternating. If you empty the psychiatric institutions, the prison population goes up. If you empty the prison population, the psychiatric population goes up. These are not simple questions. And as we discuss the body, we are also taking a stance with what we regard as behavior in a normative sense, normal, abnormal. As we're approaching the body and developing an account of the person, we're stepping into water that has been discussed as long as there's been discussions. We each speak from an animated position, and what we today discuss rather dispassionately about cognitive systems comes in the wake of discussion of mind, which has refused to be disciplined, which comes in the wake of all of thousands of years of discussion about animation or the soul. This is not a purely Christian concern. And that the contestation goes on is obvious today in the pandemic situation, where you will have a hard time understanding other people's responses. You probably have strong feelings, for example, about vaccination and its suitability, and you probably know people who have divergent feelings, showing that this work is always ongoing. So as we approach embodied cognition, we have to be very serious about this, and sometimes claims are made that one is doing an embodied cognitive science that are laughable. So this kind of trivial treatment of the body arises, you may recognize it in studies that have this kind of character. In a Yale study, 41 students were divided into two groups. Group A held a cup of hot coffee. Group B held a cup of iced coffee. They were then sent off to do a test where they evaluated the personality of an imaginary individual based on spurious information. Group A were far likelier to judge the fictitious character as warm and friendly than Group B. This has some of the superficial garments of science. There's an experiment with two well-defined conditions. Measurements were made, and no doubt statistical analysis was done. That kind of measurement is often taken to be a hallmark of science. It's not a hallmark of science. The 41 students here are a convenient sample. So much of psychological research has been done on students inadvertently standing in for the whole of humanity. The finding is one of a whole barrage of findings based on studies with small numbers of students that produce intuitively appealing effects. Look at that. With no possible causal basis, and that leave the construction of the person within the psychological vocabulary entirely untroubled. We will not be treating the body in this trivial fashion, and this should not be held as representative of embodied cognition. We will be asking what happens when we center the body, given that we now have to ask hard questions about the association of the body with the person. And with that, we are going to be coming immediately into contact with the very kinds of views that go on to make up society, make up culture, make up the human world. So if we center the body, we might think of this. This is a singular unit made up of parts, well-defined parts called organs. This is more or less the body constructed within contemporary medical science, which is very, very good at considering the interoperation of these parts in the service of that one whole. This kind of medicine is Western medicine. There are many other approaches to medicine, and most fans of Western medicine treat other approaches to medicine with a great deal of contempt, where it might be worth seeing that other approaches to medicine come with other ways of viewing and centering the body. Western medicine is often called allopathic medicine, and it's that term, which is not in widespread use, serves to distinguish it from its arch-enemy, homeopathy. If you get into that kind of discussion, you're talking about the history of medical science. This is not the only way to center the body. This, too, is a body. This is an animated body. All those questions about cognitive systems, minds, and souls are questions of animation, of who the forces are that cause a body to move. This particular body comes from a Japanese dance tradition, Buto, which emphasizes the animation of the body by forces that are brutal, bestial, possibly demonic, possibly angelic, but not the well-ordered psychological subject. And we all move with passion, with emotion, under the currents of many, many kinds of forces. So when we come to view the body, we'll see in the embodied cognitive science literature a great deal of confusion. We'll see the body referred to sometimes as an organism, sometimes as an animal even. In ecological psychology, that sometimes happens, to my horror. We'll see the body assumed to be the body constructed by medical science. We'll see the body sometimes described as a system. And in all these cases, there'll be an assumption that we're also somehow talking about people. The embodied cognitive science literature is very confused on this point. The body of parts that we saw, constructed by Western medicine, is not the same thing as an organism. When we frame a unity as an organism, we have a limited vocabulary at our disposal. Since Darwin, we must see ourselves somehow as organisms, but we're not sure how to do that. The term animal strikes fear into our hearts because animals are also embodied beings. They're also organisms, but we're allowed to kill them. So the border between what you can kill and what you cannot kill seems to lie with the animal. You can't have sex with animals, you can with humans, but you can kill animals and not humans. The category of animal is much more complicated than this. maybe we need to consider ourselves as animals/organisms. Maybe the beetle, for example, might help us here. There's so many kinds of beetles. Who was it said that the creator must have had an inordinate fondness for beetles? And they come in all kinds of shapes, and they don't invoke strong feelings of animality. They're weird. They're organisms. I don't know. If we look at reproductive behavior in this register, it looks rather different than if we were looking at a movie about romantic love, for example. But these too are bodies. We're talking about persons. We're talking about people. And the story that we're constructing is a story that aspires to inclusiveness when it comes to our kind. Our kind, meaning other persons. Working that out then in the different registers does not solve our problems, but if we're going to center the body, these bodies have to be centered as well as all other bodies. We are constructing the person in the manner in which we treat the body. That the body is contested, no woman will need telling this. The question of who has what rights over what bodies has been with us the whole time. It's the question behind slavery, it's the question behind abortion rights, the negotiation of, it's a question if you're told to wear pants, that's a social agreement that dictates how your body is to appear. I hope you can see that these are not trivial questions, and they will not admit of mechanistic solutions. Finally, as we center the body, I give you this horrendous example from data science in which images of faces are averaged in order to come up with cultural expressions of orgasm. This is not a source of wisdom. This is data science gone mad. So as we turn towards the body, the basic distinction I want to draw your attention to is that between a one-directional relationship, as seen on the top, which I've labeled button press, which goes from subject to world, with a reciprocal relationship in which there are two sides to all action. One is not only acts, but is acted upon. I've called this the handshake model. Let me elaborate a little more on these. On the top, we elaborate on the button press model. When you go to a vending machine, you push a button and a can of Coke comes out. It looks like you simply issued a command and the world responded. The world is, in other words, at your control. This is the understanding of the relationship between the subject and world in any discourse concerned with free will, for example. The assumption of an autonomous subject separated from its world is part of the narrative that we wish to leave behind in this module. In such a narrative, there will be clear distinctions between subjects and objects, and the objects will be satisfyingly concrete. They will be kickable, tappable, solid, whereas the subject will dissolve into this bizarre set of terms around mind, soul, cognitive system. Where we are going to look at approaches that emphasize reciprocity. In a handshake, two hands are involved, but neither one dictates or controls the other. Rather, the handshake arises in their interaction. That's the essence of reciprocity. And when we approach the being of the body in the world in this fashion, both subjects and the objective world become less well defined. There's no way around that. And so here we meet the confusion between orgasms, animals, systems, bodies, and persons. And as the subject now becomes a little bit more concrete, because the subject in the button press thing was totally mysterious. Now we have various kinds of subjects to consider, so they bring into being various kinds of associated worlds. The world is not something we can simply assume. To go with the confusion about subjects, we'll find confusion about world, environment, surrounding, context, milieu, Umwelt. We'll find a barrage of terms, all of which are the complement to the subjective term. So we're left behind any simple subjective-objective duality, and we're looking at relation. In this context, One model that's often discussed, that's very useful for gearing our intuitions and making us aware of a very important point, is the Watt governor. The Watt governor is a device that was invented to regulate the pressure of steam within a large steam engine. In the large steam engine, there's a circulation of steam, and the pressure of that circulatory system needs to be kept within ranges, much like the circulation of your blood needs to be kept within range, or like the thermostat keeps the room temperature within a specific range. On the left, you can see the actual Watt governor attached to a monstrously large engine. On the right, you can see a schematic of it, and it's a very simple device. It has a central spindle with two balls at the end of arms, and the spindle is caused to rotate by the steam circulating within the steam engine. If the pressure is high, that rotation will be fast, in which case the balls will rise up. As they rise up, they're attached to a valve which they open, thereby reducing the steam pressure. As the steam pressure lowers, the balls will sink down, thereby closing the valve, which will allow the pressure to rise, causing the balls to go up. So they'll settle into an equilibrium here, and variations in the steam pressure within the system will be evened out so that the steam pressure stays within what we might call a homeostatic range. Brilliant invention, very, very simple. You now understand everything there is to understand about it. But let us consider a situation in which you did not know what was going on, and you merely came to a steam engine and you found this thing in a black box. And you were told it was the controller that controlled steam pressure. It's a black box, so you know nothing about what's inside. And after a lot of observation, you might decide that you understand how it works. You could come up easily with an algorithmic description of its operation. And that would look like this. Inside this black box, something is sensing, registering, measuring the steam pressure. It's then comparing it to a threshold value, and depending on the outcome of that comparison, it's going to either open the valve or close the valve. That computational description would be adequate. You would feel that you had some understanding of what was going on. If we take the box off now and you look inside, the computational description looks rather inadequate because you now know how it's actually done. So we can have descriptional equivalence in a computational register and in, physical register. I've chosen this example because we're safely in the domain of physics and forces. As we come to the body, the word physical might need some consideration. But we can come up with two contrasting accounts, each of which is descriptionally equivalent. One other important lesson that we can learn from the Watt governor is this. When we describe it as a governor, or we interpret it as a controller of any sort, we have effected a separation between the governor and the steam engine. In the physical domain, they form one continuous system, and there is no actual juncture, no hiatus, no split between them. They are one continuous system. The apportionment of a function to this part rather than this part reflects the goals, desires, and skill of the engineer. The engineer built it like this, and they installed the Watt governor to perform precisely this task. That distinction is not given in the system itself. It is the goal, the description in terms of goals, purposes, functions, lies in the head of the engineer and not in the plant, the system itself, the engine plus governor. This makes us uncomfortably aware that anytime we ascribe functions, purposes, and goals to a system, we as observers are implicated. This is an extremely important point that has consequences for science that are still being worked out, that came out of the study of cybernetic or feedback control systems. The Watt governor is a simple first-order cybernetic system in which we can describe the link between the governor and the plant as one of negative feedback. But our awareness that we introduce the distinction between these two parts of what is itself an undivided unity. That's the second order cybernetic intuition. And we'll be spending some time getting to that. So because of this contestation, I don't want to sell you any theory of embodied cognitive science. For the readings this week, I've provided 3 short required readings, one on Breitenberg vehicles, one guarding against trivialization of the notion of the body, and the third one is an encyclopedic short listing of many approaches to embodiment. Then I provide you with some more substantive papers, and there's far too many of them there for you to read. What are you going to do? What I'd like you to do is skim the abstracts of them all, and then choose to read, say, 2 of them. One of them is a video. This way, when we come to class, we'll all have read in depth, somewhat different sources, but hopefully the themes introduced here in this video will allow us to have a conversation. Do skim the abstracts of all of them, though, so that you have a vague idea of what other people are reading. And that way we should have fun in class.